Welcome to Epic HFY Stories. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to check if you've subscribed to our channel. It's completely free, and subscribing will ensure that our stories show up more often in your feed. Dax Walker wiped the sweat from his brow, his tired muscles aching, as he took a step back to inspect his work. The Wanderer's ghost, a weathered cargo hauler, was looking better than when it had arrived. It had seen more than its fair share of damage, its hull scorched and bent, as if it had barely survived a direct hit from a plasma cannon. But now? Now, thanks to Dax's skill with a welding torch and a fair amount of elbow grease, it was ready to take on the galaxy again. "All right, she's good to go," he murmured, running his hand down the smooth, freshly repaired side of the ship. The Zenti merchant standing off to the side watched him with the impatience of someone who clearly couldn't wait to get the ship out of here. The Zenti had 4 arms, each one working independently to tap on his datapad, while the other 2 rubbed together in a nervous rhythm. Dax had learned long ago that Zenti merchants had one speed: fast. No time for pleasantries. No time for small talk. "Excellent, excellent," the merchant said, his voice a strange mix of excitement and anxious energy. "Walker, you are one of the least incompetent mechanics I've encountered. This is high praise." Dax chuckled softly, accepting the payment with a wave of his hand. The Zenti didn't need to hear him express gratitude. He was just doing his job. Yeah. "Pleasure doing business," Dax replied, already thinking of the drink that awaited him at the Rusted Wrench, the bar he frequented on Port Osiris. Port Osiris, floating in the void near a dying star, wasn't the most glamorous of places. It was a rusting heap of metal that served as a hub for those who didn't want to be found. Smugglers, freelancers, bounty hunters, anyone who lived a life off the radar found their way to this place. Dax fit in just fine. He wasn't looking to make a name for himself. He was just trying to get by. He made his way through the dingy streets of the station, the flickering neon lights casting long shadows, until he reached the familiar, welcoming doors of the Rusted Wrench. The bar's entrance creaked as he pushed it open, the musty air mixed with the scent of fried food, old beer, and the occasional whiff of engine grease, just the way he liked it. The low murmur of conversation filled the air, and the rhythmic clinking of glasses made him feel at home. Dax stepped up to the counter, ready for the quiet solitude of his favorite seat at the far end of the bar. But as soon as he ordered his drink, everything changed. The atmosphere in the bar shifted. Conversation slowed. The sound of clinking glasses became muffled. Even the usual hum of the station seemed to fade into the background. Dax paused, feeling the sudden shift, his instincts going on high alert. He turned toward the door, knowing something was about to happen. And that's when he saw her. She stood in the entrance, silhouetted by the harsh station lights. The room seemed to shrink in comparison to her. She was tall, taller than most men, even the ones who were used to standing tall, and broad-shouldered, her armor gleaming like the polished obsidian. It was etched with glowing, intricate symbols that pulsed with an otherworldly light, casting an eerie glow around her. Her presence filled the room, and Dax could almost feel the weight of her gaze before it even locked onto him. Dax's heart skipped a beat. Ascari warrior. The unmistakable insignia on her chest plate confirmed it. High-ranking. Dangerous. The Ascari were known throughout the galaxy for one thing: war. Conquest. They solved disputes with a blade, not with words. They didn't come to bars to socialize. And yet, here she was. Her piercing emerald eyes swept across the bar, locking onto Dax as though she'd known exactly where to find him. He froze. Those eyes. There was something predatory in them, like a hunter sizing up its prey. Dax felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing to process what was happening. She moved toward him, her boots heavy with purpose, cutting through the crowd like a predator moving through the underbrush. The low murmurs of the bar patrons slowly died, leaving only the sound of her approaching footsteps. Dax couldn't tear his eyes away. He should have moved. He should have said something, anything, but he was frozen in place. The bar was silent now, every eye on the two of them. And then she spoke. Dax Walker. Her voice was smooth, yet commanding, each syllable cutting through the tension like a blade. There was no question in her tone, no uncertainty. It was as if she had already decided everything for both of them. Dax blinked, his brain struggling to catch up. Me? You mean, me? Her gaze didn't shift. It remained locked onto him, unwavering, like she was waiting for him to catch up. Yes. You. Her voice was final. Dax felt his throat tighten. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. The bar around them seemed to hold its collective breath. Right, he said, struggling to stay casual. Listen, if this is about a repair job, I can fit you in next week. I charge extra for hull damage, though. So if you've been in a fight— I am not here for repairs, she interrupted, cutting him off with a look that was as sharp as a blade. Her voice was steady, firm. I am here for you. Dax froze. The room seemed to close in around him. What? He blinked, trying to process the words. You will be my mate. The entire bar went silent. The noise of clinking glasses, the low hum of the station, all of it seemed to disappear in that one surreal moment. Dax's drink hovered mid-air, forgotten. He stared at her, his mind racing. What? You will be my mate, she repeated, this time with an air of finality. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Dax opened and closed his mouth a few times, trying to figure out how to respond. Okay, appreciate the enthusiasm, but I'm pretty sure that's not how this works in Ascari culture. It is, she said simply, as though explaining a fact of life. Well, in my culture, Dax stammered, trying to force some levity into the situation. We usually start with dinner before lifelong commitments. She didn't even flinch. I have no need for human courtship rituals. I have chosen you. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Dax felt every eye in the bar on him, but all he could focus on was her. Her tall frame, her unyielding gaze, her presence that seemed to bend reality itself. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm flattered, he muttered weakly. But I don't think the whole claiming thing applies here. I'm not Ascari. Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer. Do you reject me? Dax blinked. What? Her voice grew sharper. Do you reject me? He panicked. No, not at all. You're very impressive. This whole thing, it feels a little rushed, you know? Her expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly, then spoke with cold precision. You may reject me by presenting 3 impossible trials. Dax's heart skipped a beat. What? If I fail, she continued, I shall release you. Dax took a deep breath, running his hands through his hair. He thought quickly, the wheels in his mind turning. This was his chance. He could make these trials so ridiculous that even an Ascari warrior couldn't possibly succeed. All right, he said, leaning forward with a smirk. You want impossible? Here you go. Steal a warlord's flagship, tame a void beast, and survive a duel against your own people. She didn't even blink. Done. Dax's mouth went dry. What do you mean, done? Done, she repeated, as if it were a simple statement. With that, she turned and strode out of the bar, her presence lingering in the room like a storm that had already passed. The bar erupted into murmurs. Dax sat frozen, staring after her. "I'm so screwed," he muttered under his breath, burying his face in his hands. The days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who had no idea how his life had turned upside down. Dax Walker had spent the better part of a week oscillating between disbelief, panic, and an overwhelming desire to fake his own death. Sashara Vex had left the bar after that conversation, her declaration still hanging in the air like the faint smell of burnt metal. He kept telling himself it was a joke, a big, weird, alien joke. He was sure of it. There was no way someone like her, an Ascari warrior of all things, was serious about marrying him, right? But when he woke up the next day, the reality of the situation crashed down on him. Sashara had given him a challenge, a chance to reject her, but only if he could make the tasks impossible. And Dax, with his usual brand of half-baked bravado, had agreed to it. He paced his workshop, muttering to himself, trying to distract his mind with the tools and engines around him. He was a mechanic, not a warrior. He was good with his hands, not with blades or space battles. There was no way she could actually succeed at those tasks, right? Stealing a warlord's flagship? Taming a void beast? Surviving a duel with her own kind? They were impossible, and that's exactly what he had hoped for. His mind raced as he mentally prepared for the inevitable call. A triumphant Sashara returning to claim him as her mate, having failed miserably at the impossible trials he had set before her. But then, 7 days and 12 hours later, the announcement came. Dax was sitting at the rusted wrench, trying his best to drown out the stares from the regulars who had taken an unhealthy interest in his newly complicated life. He was halfway through nursing his drink when every screen in the bar flickered to life and the overhead speakers crackled. The place fell quiet. A robotic voice came through, sounding desperate and slightly frantic. "This is an urgent bulletin from the Imperial News Network. The warlord Korak's personal flagship, the Unyielding Blade, has been stolen. Repeat. The Unyielding Blade has been stolen. Warlord Korak has issued a sector-wide bounty for the return of his vessel and the capture of the thief. The suspect has been identified as..." The feed cut to a grainy, shaky security camera recording. There, in full glory, was Sashara. Her towering, armored form stood on the bridge of the stolen flagship, hands on her hips, her expression relaxed, as if this was the easiest thing in the galaxy. Behind her, chaos was unfolding, crew members running in every direction, alarms blaring as the ship was taken without a single shot fired. Dax's stomach dropped. "By the void," Jorgo, the regular sitting beside him, muttered under his breath. "She actually did it." Dax was speechless. "How?" he asked, half laughing in disbelief. No one had an answer. The how didn't matter anymore. The what did. She had succeeded. The first task was completed. His mind raced. Maybe it was luck. Maybe Korak had been caught napping, and Sashara just slipped by unnoticed, swiping the ship in the dead of night. Maybe. Maybe she just took the ship, and it wasn't as hard as he'd thought. Jorgo tapped at his datapad, looking up at Dax. "You think Korak misplaced his own flagship?" he asked, giving Dax a flat look. Dax sighed, his thoughts spiraling out of control. "I need to believe that," he muttered. But before he could dwell on it further, a new bulletin appeared on the screen. "Breaking news. A void beast has been spotted near the derelict mall. It is not hostile. We repeat, it is not hostile. Reports indicate the creature has been tamed. The timer is Sashara Vex, accompanied by an Ascari warrior." The camera cut to footage of the massive void beast, a terrifying apex predator that could rip through ships with ease. Yet there it was, calmly walking alongside Sashara, its deadly eyes following her every step. And right beside her, standing tall and proud, was a newly tamed creature, an apex predator that defied the very laws of nature. Dax's jaw went slack. "No," he said, shaking his head. No, this can't be real." But there she was, the impossible task number 2 already checked off. "Snuffles," Jorgo said nonchalantly, looking over his shoulder at Dax's stunned expression. "That's the name she gave the beast." Dax blinked in disbelief. "You're kidding me." He snatched the datapad from Jorgo's hand, staring at the update. "Void beast spotted on outer rim. Now responds to Snuffles." He slapped a hand over his face. "Why is this my life?" he groaned, sinking back into his seat, utterly defeated. But things were far from over. A new transmission came in, flashing across the holographic display. Dax barely registered the flickering light before he looked up, and there she was again, standing tall in his workshop. This time, the look of satisfaction on her face was impossible to ignore. "Dax Walker," she said, her tone calm, but with that unmistakable gleam of triumph. "I have completed 2 of your trials." Dax let out a strangled laugh. "Yeah, no kidding. A warlord's flagship? A void beast?" She smiled, her eyes gleaming. "Only one task remains." Dax's stomach twisted. He knew what it was. He knew. The final task, the duel. She was going to face an Ascari general, a fellow warrior, and Dax had a horrible feeling that things weren't going to end well. He rubbed his temples. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, staring at her, struggling to come to terms with the chaos his life had become. "I've already issued the challenge," she said, as though it were a casual thing. "The fight is scheduled for tomorrow." Dax's eyes widened. "Wait, you're going to fight one of your own people?" She nodded. "I will challenge General Veer. A general, no less. Someone with honor, someone with power. It will be glorious." Glorious, Dax thought bitterly. He was terrified for her, terrified of what was going to happen. "Sashara," Dax said, his voice cracking. "This is insane. This is impossible. You can't just fight your own kind like this." "I will," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And I will win." Dax groaned, slumping against the table. His worst fear was becoming a reality. The duel was tomorrow. And if she won, that meant, well, it meant he was screwed. The hours leading up to the duel felt like a strange kind of nightmare, one Dax couldn't wake up from. Every part of him was screaming that this couldn't be happening, that he was caught in a dream, or maybe, more likely, a cosmic joke. But the clock ticked on, and reality, as always, was far more brutal. Dax sat at the bar in the rusted wrench, nursing a drink that had long since gone cold. His stomach churned with anxiety, his mind a constant whirl of panic and disbelief. The crowd around him had grown more animated as the news spread, as it always did, on Port Osiris. Word was that Sashara had made it to the station's combat arena, where Ascari warriors settled their scores in brutal duels to the death. Dax had been to the arena once or twice, but never to watch a fight like this. Never with so much at stake. Jorgo, his regular bar companion, slid into the seat beside him, his eyes glinting with the kind of dangerous curiosity Dax had learned to expect from him. "Big day, huh?" Jorgo asked, his voice light, but his eyes studying Dax with an unspoken question. Dax ran a hand through his hair. "Big day? That's one way to put it." His words came out in a strained laugh, but they felt hollow. He had watched enough duels between Ascari warriors to know how they fought. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about honor. It was about survival. And Sashara? She didn't just want to survive. She wanted to win. And if she won, she'd be coming for him. She's going to die, Dax muttered under his breath, the words feeling like an unwanted truth. She has to die. There's no way she can survive this. But even as he said it, the words felt wrong. He didn't want her to die. No matter how impossible the situation was, no matter how insane her quest for him had seemed, there was something in her, a kind of fierce determination that made him feel uneasy. Like maybe, just maybe, she would succeed. He pushed the thought away, slamming his empty glass down on the counter. I can't keep doing this. This isn't my fight. Yorgo just gave him a look. It's too late for that, he said quietly, almost sympathetically. She's made it this far. She's not going to stop. And if she does, well, we both know what that means. Dax's heart sank. He knew. If she lost, it wouldn't just be the end of her. It would be the end of everything. The Ascari didn't fight to lose, and their warriors didn't simply walk away from a duel defeated. The door to the rusted wrench banged open, and for a moment the room fell into silence. Dax turned his head, half expecting to see Sashara herself, her towering form, her emerald eyes glowing with victory. But it wasn't her. It was a trio of Ascari warriors, all wearing the same dark armor, their faces grim. They stood like statues in the doorway, eyes scanning the room with that cold, calculating stare that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Dax's heart skipped a beat. The leader of the trio stepped forward, his presence commanding the room with a quiet authority. He had the same aura of deadly calm that Sashara had, only his was colder, more terrifying. This was a general, one who had seen countless battles and had no mercy in his soul. The general's voice was deep, resonating with power. The duel is set to begin, he said, his eyes fixed on Dax. If you wish to watch, now is your time. But be warned. He paused, his gaze shifting, and Dax felt a shiver run down his spine. You may not want to see what happens next. Dax swallowed, nodding slowly, though he was already standing, his legs unsteady beneath him. The general's warning wasn't needed. He already knew. He wasn't sure why he was going. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the need to see it for himself. But deep down, he knew there was more to this duel than just a fight between two warriors. This was about everything. About Sashara's claim over him, about the fate of her life, and about how all of this had spun so far out of control that it was impossible to even imagine a way out. The combat arena wasn't much to look at. It was a converted cargo bay, surrounded by reinforced walls and an overwhelming sense of danger in the air. The floor was marked with the remnants of countless battles, a patchwork of bloodstains and scorch marks from weapons far more deadly than Dax ever wanted to imagine. Dax stood in the back, his heart hammering in his chest as the crowd buzzed with excitement. They were Ascari warriors, bred for battle and glory. The stands were filled with their faces, their eyes eager, their muscles tense. They had come to witness a spectacle, a showdown between two of their own kind. Sashara stepped into the ring, her tall form moving with the kind of confidence that could only come from someone who had already faced death, and won. Her armor gleamed under the arena lights, its intricate symbols pulsing with a soft glow. Dax's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, his stomach a twisted knot of fear and admiration. She was ready. Across from her stood General Veer, even taller than Sashara, his massive frame a wall of muscle. He was more than just a warrior. He was a general. His armor was ornate, engraved with more markings than Dax had ever seen before. The light bounced off his dark, polished plating, making him look even more intimidating. The two warriors faced off in the center of the ring. Vier's gaze was filled with contempt, but Sashara? Her expression was unreadable, her eyes focused entirely on her opponent. "You challenge me over a human?" General Vier's voice was thick with disdain, his words laced with the kind of arrogance that came from years of victory. "This is beneath me." Sashara didn't flinch. She simply rolled her shoulders, her eyes narrowing. "I do." And just like that, the fight began. The sound of metal crashing against metal filled the arena as Vier swung his massive blade down toward her. Sashara danced around him with unnatural grace, her movement so fast that Dax could barely keep up. The clash of weapons echoed in the arena, and the crowd roared with excitement. Vier was relentless, his strikes heavy and brutal, but Sashara moved like water, fluid and precise. She ducked under his blows, her blade flashing as she parried and countered, each movement calculated, each strike purposeful. Dax gripped the railing in front of him, his knuckles white. His breath caught in his chest as he watched, unable to tear his eyes away. It was a battle unlike any he'd ever seen. Raw power, skill, and a determination that was terrifying. And then, in a split second, it happened. Vier made a mistake. A single misstep, and Sashara took advantage. Her blade sliced through the air in a flash, striking him across the chest plate. Vier staggered back, a deep gash across his armor, his breath heavy as he tried to recover. But it was too late. In the blink of an eye, Sashara moved again, her blade flashing twice, faster than Dax could even comprehend. Vier collapsed to his knees, his weapon clattering to the floor as he struggled to catch his breath. The crowd went wild, but Dax couldn't hear them. He was frozen in place, staring at Sashara, who stood victorious over the general she had just defeated. Her gaze met his across the arena. Dax's stomach dropped, his body stiff with disbelief. This was it. She had won. She had actually won. The roar of the crowd echoed in Dax's ears, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. His eyes locked on Sashara, standing in the center of the arena, victorious. She had done it. Against all odds, she had won, defeating a general, her own kind, in single combat. The roar of the warriors around him grew louder, their chants and cheers rising in a frenzy. But Dax's world had narrowed down to just her, the woman who had already claimed more than any human could ever imagine. She was standing tall, her back straight, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the battle, but her eyes never left him. Dax felt a strange, inexplicable weight in his chest. He had expected her to lose. He had wanted her to lose. Because if she lost, then this insane, impossible situation would be over. But now everything was different. Sashara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his as she walked toward him, the crowd parting like a sea before her. She was a force, unstoppable, untouchable. Her emerald eyes were still glowing faintly from the battle, and every step she took exuded power and certainty. Dax found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away. He had thought she was just a warrior, a dangerous, deadly woman who had come to claim him. But now, with her standing before him, all he could feel was the overwhelming presence of someone who had proven herself beyond measure. "Dax Walker," she said, her voice calm and steady, yet it cut through the noise of the arena with a sharp clarity. The crowd quieted in anticipation. Dax swallowed hard, unsure of what to do next. "You were witness to my trials," Sashara continued, her voice unwavering. "I have completed them. I have won." Dax's throat went dry. Yeah, You've won, he muttered under his breath, still trying to process everything. You've done the impossible. Again. Sashara didn't smile, didn't show any sign of arrogance. She simply looked at him, her gaze sharp. Now, you belong to me. The words hit Dax like a punch to the gut. What? He said, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. Wait, hold on. I belong to you? Do you doubt my claim? She asked, her voice low, but filled with that same determination that had carried her through the impossible tasks. I have defeated your trials. You are mine now. Dax's mind raced. He had been through enough to understand that nothing about this situation was normal, but this was beyond anything he could ever have imagined. I don't know about this, Dax said, trying to maintain some semblance of control. I didn't exactly ask for this, you know. You did, Sashara said simply, her expression unreadable. You presented the trials. You gave me the challenge. You wanted impossible. I made them possible. Her voice softened just slightly, but the weight of her words remained heavy. Now you will stand by me as my mate. This is how it is. Dax felt a sharp, almost suffocating tension in the air. He stared at her, unsure of what to say, unsure of what was happening. He had been trying to escape this moment, to avoid the inevitable conclusion that was bearing down on him like a freight train. But now that it was here, he found himself strangely conflicted. You've done all that, he muttered, still not entirely sure how he was supposed to react. You've stolen a warlord's flagship, tamed a void beast, and defeated a general. I mean, how do I even compete with that? Sashara tilted her head slightly, considering him with a curious gaze. You do not need to compete, she said simply. I have chosen you. And you, Dax Walker, will now choose whether you accept or reject my claim. A wave of confusion washed over Dax. He felt trapped, like he was caught in a whirlwind of events that were spiraling out of his control. And yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about her presence. The way she had proven herself, not just to him but to an entire arena of warriors, made him feel a sense of awe, even if he wasn't sure how to process it. I didn't ask for this, Dax said again, more to himself than to her. He felt like he was stumbling through a nightmare where nothing made sense, and he had no idea how to wake up. Sashara's gaze softened, just the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Then you will have time to adjust, she said, her voice gentle now, though still firm. But know this, I am patient. I will wait until you are ready. Dax was speechless for a moment, his mind trying to process what was happening. Wait, he said, his voice rising in disbelief. You're giving me time? You, Sashara Vex, Ascari warrior, the Ascari warrior who just took down a general. You're going to wait for me? She nodded, her eyes steady, unwavering. Yes, you will come to me, on your own terms. But know that this is not just about claiming you as my mate. Dax frowned, his confusion deepening. Then what is it about? She stepped closer, and the weight of her presence seemed to fill the room. It is about connection, she said softly, her eyes searching his. About bridging our worlds, the human and the Ascari. About forging something more than just strength, something deeper. Dax stared at her, the realization settling in like a weight in his chest. For the first time, he understood. This wasn't just about victory or a simple claim. Sashara wasn't just a warrior, and this wasn't just about a fight. It was about understanding. Her challenge was more than just tests of strength. It was about bridging the divide between their worlds, humanity and the Ascari. She had wanted him to see something beyond himself, beyond the normal boundaries of his life, and now he had to decide whether he would accept that challenge too. "All right," Dax said finally, his voice steadying. "All right, I'll give you this. We'll figure this out. But first, we're doing this my way." Sashara's smile was small, but it was there. "Then we shall," she agreed. And just like that, the storm that had been raging around him began to calm. Dax didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange, uneasy sense of peace settle in his chest. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. The days following the duel were a blur. Port Osiris seemed to quiet down, its usual hum of activity replaced by a strange, unsettled stillness. People were still talking about Sashara's victory, but it was clear that the battle wasn't the only thing on their minds. Whispers swirled through the station like a constant undercurrent, gossip and speculation about the future of Dax Walker and the mighty Ascari warrior who had claimed him. Dax tried to focus on his work, trying to ignore the stares that followed him as he moved through the station. It was like walking through a field of eyes, each one weighing him, judging him. But it wasn't just the station's inhabitants that had him on edge. It was Sashara. She had given him time. Time to think, to adjust. But every time he saw her, that feeling of unease crept back in. He wasn't sure what this was, what was happening between them. There was a strange magnetism to her. She had proven herself more times than he could count, but Dax couldn't shake the feeling that he was constantly teetering on the edge of something he couldn't fully grasp, something big. Sashara had stayed mostly out of sight after the duel, retreating to her own quarters, giving Dax space. But every day, she was there, watching, waiting, like a shadow that never quite left. Finally, a week later, she approached him again. The weight of her presence was unmistakable as she entered his workshop. The familiar hum of machinery and tools fell silent in her wake. Her figure filled the doorway, tall, powerful, and yet, in this moment, she seemed almost vulnerable. She was still the same fierce warrior who had taken on impossible tasks, but there was something different in the way she looked at him now. "Dax?" she said, her voice steady but softer than it had been before. Dax didn't look up from the engine he was tinkering with, trying to focus, trying to avoid the overwhelming feeling of being caught in her gaze. But he could feel her, standing there, just out of sight. "Yeah?" he said, his voice hoarse from days of silent contemplation. "We need to talk." Her words hung in the air like a weight. He set the wrench down on the workbench, wiping his hands on a rag, finally looking at her. Her emerald eyes met his, and for the first time, he didn't see the warrior. He saw the woman, the person who had gone through hell and back, who had proven herself time and time again, and who, for some strange reason, had chosen him. He didn't know what to say. Part of him still wanted to run, to push her away, to pretend none of this was real. But another part of him, a part that he couldn't ignore anymore, wanted to hear what she had to say. He wanted to understand what all of this meant. "I'm listening," Dax said, his voice low. She stepped closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. There was no rush in her now. She wasn't a warrior ready for battle. She was just a woman standing in front of him, asking for something. He wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel the weight of it. "I didn't come to you as a conqueror," she began, her tone quiet but firm. "I didn't do any of this to force you into something you didn't want. I didn't steal a warlord's ship or tame a void beast because I thought it would impress you. I did it because I wanted to prove something to myself. And to you." Dax frowned, not sure where she was going with this. "Prove something? To me?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes. I wanted to prove that I could do the impossible. But more than that, I wanted to prove that I could make a connection, not just with my people, but with someone else, someone who sees the world differently, someone who understands that strength isn't just about power or combat. It's about choosing to walk a path together, despite the odds. Dax stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always thought of her as a warrior, an unstoppable force, someone who could face anything head-on. But now, standing before him, she wasn't just that. She was something more. She was human, in a way that he hadn't expected. I don't know if I'm the right person for that, Dax said quietly, his voice almost uncertain for the first time. You've done so much more than I ever could. I'm just a mechanic, a fixer. I'm not sure I belong in this world you're asking me to join. Sashara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. There was no anger in her movements, no forceful demand. Just a quiet confidence that had always been there. But now, it was softer. You don't have to be anything more than you already are, she said, her voice gentle, but filled with purpose. You don't need to prove anything to me. You've already done that by being here, by surviving, by accepting the challenge. That's all I've ever asked of you, to be yourself. Dax's chest tightened, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, something that felt right. For the first time since all of this had started, he didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel like he was drowning in an ocean of impossible choices. He felt connected. What if I'm not ready? Dax asked, his voice quieter than before. Sashara smiled, the first genuine smile Dax had seen from her. It was small, but it was enough to change everything. Then we take it slow. We start with dinner, she said, her eyes gleaming. And maybe, if you're not too terrified, we'll see where it goes from there. Dax let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He laughed softly, shaking his head. Dinner, huh? He muttered. I think I can handle that. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Dax felt a spark of hope flicker inside him. Maybe he wasn't ready to walk the path with her completely. But he was willing to try. For the first time in a long while, he was ready to take the leap. The days after the duel seemed to slow down, as if the universe itself was taking a moment to catch its breath. Port Osiris, a station once buzzing with the usual chaos, had fallen into a temporary calm, a strange quiet hanging over it. But for Dax, everything was still spinning in his head. Sashara's words echoed in his mind. We start with dinner. A simple request, but one that felt monumental. He wasn't sure why it mattered so much. After all, they'd been through so much already. But there was something about the simplicity of it that struck a chord with him. The idea of just sitting down, sharing a meal, talking, no grand expectations, no world-shaking consequences, was a relief. It was a step back, away from the insanity of the past few weeks. Dax had spent so much time trying to outrun his feelings, trying to bury the chaos of it all under layers of humor and sarcasm. But now, here he was, about to take a step into something real, something that wasn't just about survival or combat or impossible trials. Sashara had given him space, but he could feel her presence at the edge of his thoughts, always there, waiting. And now, he was ready. Or at least, he thought he was. That evening, Dax met Sashara at a small diner on the lower levels of Port Osiris. It was the kind of place that most people would avoid, a run-down, neon-lit hole in the wall where the food was questionable at best, and the service even more so. But to Dax, it was perfect. It was familiar, quiet, and most importantly, it didn't feel like a place where he'd have to be anyone other than himself. When he walked through the door, he found her already seated in a booth by the window. She had chosen the seat with the best view of the station's dark expanse. Her back straight, her eyes scanning the room as if she were still on guard, ever vigilant. But when she saw him, her expression softened. The fierce warrior mask slipped away just slightly, revealing something more vulnerable. "Dax," she said, her voice warm but controlled, the usual commanding tone replaced with something gentler. "Hey," Dax replied, offering a smile. "I wasn't sure you were serious about this whole dinner thing." He slid into the seat across from her, his nerves showing in the tightness of his movements. She raised an eyebrow. "You thought I would challenge you to a duel over dinner?" Dax chuckled, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "It crossed my mind." They both laughed. Real, genuine laughter that felt like a weight had been lifted from both of their shoulders. For the first time in what felt like ages, Dax allowed himself to breathe without the looming pressure of the impossible tasks or the future that was beyond his control. He wasn't sure where this was going, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, sharing something real. As the waitress brought over their food, a steaming plate of something that Dax was pretty sure wasn't even legal in some parts of the galaxy, he looked at Sashara. Her stoic expression hadn't changed much, but there was a softness to her that hadn't been there before. She was still the fierce warrior, but she wasn't just that. She was a person, and for the first time Dax saw her as more than just the challenges she'd faced. They ate in a comfortable silence at first, the kind that spoke of mutual respect rather than awkwardness. Dax wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to being around someone who didn't demand something from him. He was used to being the fixer, the one who solved problems without ever really confronting his own. Finally, Sashara spoke, her voice quiet, but filled with purpose. "Dax, I want you to know something," she said, looking at him across the table. "I didn't choose you because I thought you were some prize to claim. I chose you because I believed in something between us. I believed that what we're building isn't about culture or duty. It's about understanding." Dax paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He wasn't sure he had ever truly understood the depth of what she was offering, but hearing her say it out loud, without the weight of the trials or the pressure of destiny hanging over them, made him see it more clearly. "I'm not sure what this is, Sashara," he admitted, his voice steady. "I mean, you've done all these impossible things. You've proven that, I don't know, you're capable of anything. But I'm just a mechanic. I fix things. I don't know if I can live up to what you've shown me." Sashara's gaze softened, and she set down her drink, her fingers gently tracing the edge of her glass. "You don't have to be anything other than who you are. That's what I've been trying to tell you." Her eyes met his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "The greatest strength isn't in how many trials you can survive or how much power you can claim. It's in how you choose to walk with someone else, how you open yourself to something bigger than you." Dax swallowed, her words settling into his mind like a weight that he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had always believed that strength was about survival, about winning battles and coming out on top, but now? Now he wasn't so sure. There was something in her gaze, something in the way she saw him, that made him wonder if he had been wrong all along. He leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "So, what now?" he asked, the question feeling both simple and complex all at once. Sashara smiled, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at the corners of her lips. "Now we take it one step at a time." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a softer tone. "No more trials, no more tests, just this. We figure it out together." Dax felt his chest tighten again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something deeper. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he was ready for the path ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone on this journey. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "One step at a time." Sashara's smile grew, her eyes shining with a new kind of warmth. And in that moment, Dax realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong to fight this connection for so long. Maybe this wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. Maybe it was just about being willing to walk alongside someone who had already proven she could conquer the impossible. The food was terrible, but neither of them seemed to care. For the first time in days, Dax felt something like peace, and that was enough. The days that followed the dinner were filled with a quiet kind of tension, an unspoken agreement between Dax and Sashara that they would take things one step at a time. For Dax, it felt like he was walking a tightrope, constantly balancing between fear and curiosity. He had never thought he'd find himself in a situation like this. But then again, he had never thought he'd be sitting across from an Ascari warrior, sipping drinks and talking about the future. The station itself had begun to settle down after the chaos of Sashara's victory, but it seemed to hum with a different energy now. The normal hustle and bustle of life on Port Osiris, the smugglers, the traders, the bounty hunters, was still there. But there was a new, quieter atmosphere hanging in the air. Word of Sashara's trials had spread far and wide, and now her presence seemed to permeate every corner of the station. Dax couldn't escape the whispers, no matter how hard he tried. People had seen her victory in the arena, heard about the impossible feats she'd pulled off. But Dax didn't care about that anymore. What mattered was that he was trying, they were trying, to build something together, away from the expectations of the galaxy around them. That morning, as Dax worked on a new project in his workshop, he felt the familiar weight of Sashara's presence behind him. The door opened quietly, and he didn't have to turn around to know it was her. He could feel it in the air, the shift in energy, the quiet confidence that always seemed to follow her. He didn't need to say anything. She simply walked in, a light smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It was the same smile she had worn the night they had dinner, the one that softened the edges of her fierce persona. Today, however, it seemed to carry something else, something more hopeful. "You're busy," she said softly, watching him work, her tone a little more relaxed than usual. "Always," Dax replied, not looking up, but he could feel the slight amusement in his voice. He set his tools down and finally turned to face her. "I've got some repairs to finish up, but it's going slow today. I think I'm a little distracted." Sashara raised an eyebrow, clearly aware that distracted was an understatement. "I see." There was something unspoken between them now, a familiarity that had grown with each passing day. They were no longer just two people caught up in the chaos of life. They were building something more. A connection that didn't rely on trials, victories, or expectations. It was simply about being present, about choosing to stand by each other, no matter how strange or impossible the circumstances seemed. "Would you like to take a walk?" she asked, her voice softer now, a quiet invitation in her words. "A walk?" Dax repeated, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. He was used to fixing things, handling machinery, making sure everything worked. Walking, though, that was a different kind of challenge, a chance to slow down. He hadn't really given himself permission to slow down in a long time. But looking at her now, standing there with that calm, unwavering gaze, he realized something. Maybe he didn't need to run from this. "Sure," he said, smiling a little. "I think I could use some fresh air." Port Osiris wasn't much to look at from the outside. There were no scenic vistas or towering skylines, no glittering city lights. It was a place that was rough around the edges, built out of necessity and fuel for the desperate. But to Dax, it was home in its own way. And as he and Sashara walked through the station's winding corridors, with the hum of old machinery surrounding them, he found a strange sense of peace. They passed by familiar faces, some curious, some indifferent. But Dax didn't care anymore. He didn't feel the weight of their stares. He was walking beside Sashara, and that was all that mattered. As they moved toward one of the quieter areas of the station, the noise of the crowds faded into the background. The air grew cooler, and a gentle breeze blew in from one of the open docking bays. Dax took a deep breath, the first one he had taken all day without feeling rushed or burdened by something. "I never thought I'd be doing this," Dax admitted, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. "Walking around, talking like this after everything that's happened." Sashara glanced over at him, her eyes flickering with curiosity. "And now?" "Now it doesn't feel so bad," he said with a slight smile, his voice quiet but genuine. "It feels good, actually." And they continued walking, side by side, with no particular destination in mind. There was no urgency, no reason to rush. For the first time since he had met Sashara, Dax felt like the weight of the universe was just a little bit lighter. The pressures of the trials, the expectations, the chaos, it all seemed to fade into the distance. He could hear her breathing beside him, steady and calm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Dax allowed himself to just be. There were no more impossible tasks, no more pressure to live up to something he wasn't. This moment, right here, with her, was enough. They stopped by a small observation window, looking out into the vast expanse of space. The stars outside twinkled softly, distant and far away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sashara was the first to break the silence. "You've proven yourself, Dax," she said, her voice almost reverent. "Not through strength, not through trials, but through your choices, through your willingness to stand with me. That's the true measure of strength." Dax turned to her, surprised by the weight of her words. He had always thought of strength as something physical, something you earned through battle or survival. But now, standing next to Sashara, he realized she was right. Strength wasn't just about fighting. It was about making choices. It was about being there for someone else. "I think I'm starting to understand that," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. Sashara smiled, the same warm, genuine smile that had first drawn him to her. It wasn't about power or triumph anymore. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "I'm glad." For the first time, Dax didn't feel like he was standing on the edge of some great unknown. The future still seemed uncertain, but it didn't feel as daunting anymore. With Sashara by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next together.